trapped in the storm with her infant brother. The Alpha King heard her weeping and found her. In the midst of the chaos, a young woman stumbled along the muddy path, her small frame shivering under a soaked cloak. Clutched tightly to her chest was a tiny bundle, her infant brother Kale, who whimpered softly against the cold. Alara's heart pounded as she pressed forward, her boots sinking into the wet earth. Each step was a struggle. The rain turned the ground into a treacherous quagmire, and the wind threatened to rip her from her feet. She could hear the distant rumble of thunder rolling over the mountains, shaking the very air around her. Her fingers ached from gripping Kale so tightly, but she could not let go. Not now. She had to keep moving. She had to survive. The past few days had been a blur of fear and loss. Their village had been attacked by soldiers loyal to a cruel lord, a man whose hunger for power knew no bounds. Alara had watched as homes burned and families scattered into the darkness. She had run through the chaos, holding Kale close, feeling helpless yet determined. She would not let him fall into the hands of those who would harm him. She would protect him, even if it meant facing the storm itself. A flash of lightning illuminated the forest, casting eerie shadows across the twisted branches. Alara's breath caught in her throat. She stumbled, nearly dropping Kale, but the baby's small hands clutched at her cloak, grounding her in the moment. "It's all right, little one," she whispered, her voice trembling but soft. "We'll be safe soon, I promise." The path twisted and turned through the dense forest, and Alara's mind raced. Where could she go? Every direction seemed the same, dark, wet, and treacherous. Her legs ached and exhaustion tugged at her very bones. But she could not stop. She would not. Kale depended on her, and somewhere in the distance, a glimmer of hope, or perhaps a chance of salvation, beckoned. She reached a small clearing and spotted the remnants of an old chapel, its stone walls blackened and crumbling with age. It looked abandoned, forgotten by time, yet it promised shelter from the storm. She ran toward it, slipping in the mud, her cloak soaked through. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, and it groaned loudly, echoing in the empty hall. Inside, the air was damp and cold, but it was dry. For the first time since the storm had begun, Alara allowed herself a brief moment of relief. Kale's cries grew louder and she pressed him to her chest. "SHH, SHH, it's all right," she soothed, rocking him gently. She could feel his warmth against her, fragile and small, and it steeled her resolve. They were alive for now. That was all that mattered. The chapel was silent except for the storm outside. Raindrops tapped against the broken roof like soft drums, and the wind whispered through the cracks in the stone walls. Alara sank to the floor, leaning against the cold wall, and let herself shiver. She felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, fear, exhaustion, grief, but she did not cry. Not yet. She had to stay strong for Kale, yet the storm seemed to sense her vulnerability. The wind grew louder, howling around the chapel, rattling the doors and windows. Lightning flashed again, illuminating the empty altar at the far end of the hall. Alara's gaze was drawn to it, and she noticed the faint outline of a figure etched into the stone. An angel, its wings spread wide, its expression solemn. She felt a strange comfort in its presence, as if it were silently promising her protection. A sudden crack of thunder made her flinch, and she hugged Kale closer. "We're not alone," she whispered to him, almost as if the words were meant to convince herself. Someone will find us." Unbeknownst to her, far beyond the storm-lashed forest, a rider moved swiftly across the hills. Cloaked in darkness, his presence seemed to command the very wind itself. He was known across the land as Dorian, the Alpha King, ruler of a kingdom feared and respected in equal measure. Rumors of his power and ruthlessness had spread for years, tales whispered in fear and awe. Yet in the midst of his journey for a mystical artifact, he had heard something unusual, a sound that cut through the roar of the storm. A soft, desperate cry. The kind of cry that could belong to no ordinary child or woman. Something deep within him stirred, a spark of curiosity, perhaps even compassion, buried beneath the years of hardened rule. He urged his horse forward, galloping through the forest with a speed and precision that seemed impossible, guided by the sound. Alara had been unaware of the figure approaching. She shivered again, rocking Kale in her arms, feeling the chill of the storm seep into her bones. Her eyes were closing from exhaustion when suddenly, a shadow passed across the doorway. She froze, clutching Kale tighter. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling with fear. A tall figure stepped into the dim light of the chapel. His cloak was dark, blending with the shadows, and his presence radiated power. The hood fell back, revealing sharp features, piercing eyes, and an expression that was both dangerous and magnetic. "Stay calm," he said, his voice low but commanding. "I mean you no harm." Alara's heart pounded. She had never seen anyone like him. His eyes were a storm of their own, strong, unyielding, and strangely gentle all at once. Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I am Dorian," he replied, "and you are in danger here. You should not be alone in this storm." Her instincts screamed at her to run, yet she could not move. There was something in his presence that demanded her attention, a quiet authority that made her hesitate. I'm protecting my brother," she said, pressing Kale closer. "I can manage." "No," Dorian interrupted firmly. "You cannot. This storm will not wait for your courage. Come, we must leave before it turns worse." Before she could protest further, he knelt and held out a strong, steady hand. Something in the way he offered help, without a trace of judgment, made her heart flutter with a mix of fear and relief. Slowly, trembling, Alara placed Kale in his arms. She felt a strange, surreal trust, like stepping into unknown waters but knowing they would not drown her. Dorian lifted Kale gently, examining the infant with care. "He is safe with me," he said softly, almost to himself. Then he offered his other hand to Alara. "Now you," she hesitated, her eyes locking with his. There was intensity there, like the eye of the storm itself. The wind howled outside, but within the chapel, a fragile calm settled over them. Finally, she took his hand, letting him guide her through the ruined doorway and into the storm. The forest was a blur of rain and lightning. The wind tugged at their cloaks, threatening to throw them off balance. Yet Dorian moved with confidence, shielding Alara and Kale with a strength that seemed beyond human. Every step he took was measured, powerful, and protective. Alara could feel her pulse racing, not just from fear, but from the closeness, the undeniable presence of someone who seemed to hold both danger and safety within him. She kept her eyes on him, silently questioning what she had just placed her trust in. But there was no time for doubt. Survival came first. Hours, or perhaps minutes, time was meaningless in the storm, passed as they moved through the forest. The sound of rushing water and breaking branches filled the air. Alara's body ached, her legs trembling with fatigue. Yet Dorian's grip on her hand never wavered. His eyes constantly scanned the surroundings, alert, unyielding, and unwavering in his focus. At last, they reached a clearing high above the valley below. The wind whipped around them, rain stinging their faces, yet here the storm seemed slightly less violent. Dorian set Kale gently on the ground, holding him close as he knelt to check on him. The baby's small eyes blinked up at him, and a faint smile broke across his tiny face. Alara sank to her knees beside them, shivering but alive. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come." Dorian's eyes softened just for a moment, revealing a depth of feeling hidden beneath years of command and solitude. "You would have survived," he said quietly. "You are stronger than you think, but even the strong sometimes need help." For a long moment they simply sat together, rain falling around them, hearts still racing, the storm raging but somehow more distant. Alara could not explain why, but she felt a strange connection to this man. The Alpha King who had appeared like a shadow in the night, yet carried the warmth of safety and strength. And as the next flash of lightning split the sky, she realized with a sudden, quiet fear and wonder. The storm had not only found her, it had brought him to her. Something had changed, and she could not yet say what it meant. The wind whispered around them, carrying a promise that the night was far from over. The storm had passed, leaving the forest glistening with fresh rain. The sky was a pale gray, and mist curled around the treetops like ghostly fingers. Alara trudged beside Dorian as he guided them down the rocky path toward his fortress, high on the cliffs overlooking the valley. Every step was uncertain. The mud made her boots heavy, and Kale slept peacefully in Dorian's strong arms, unaware of the danger they had survived. Alara's heart still raced from the storm. She could not shake the memory of thunder shaking the chapel walls, the wind trying to rip Kale from her arms, and the sudden arrival of Dorian, appearing like a shadow through the rain. He had saved them both without hesitation, as if it were second nature. Yet she could not forget the intensity of his gaze. There was something in those storm-gray eyes that unsettled her, something that both frightened and intrigued her. He was powerful, yes, but there was more than power in him. There was a weight, a depth of sorrow, and a loneliness that seemed almost visible in the way he carried himself. They reached the fortress gates, enormous and carved from dark stone, worn by centuries of wind and rain. Guards in black armor flanked the gates, watching them carefully as Dorian approached. A low murmur of recognition passed through them, and then the gates opened silently, revealing the shadowed interior of the fortress. Alara's breath caught. The walls were high and cold, but the halls beyond were vast, lit with torches that flickered against the stone. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting battles and ancient kings. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp stone. It was a place of power, a place where secrets lived in every shadow. Dorian led them to a quiet chamber near the edge of the fortress, one that looked out over the cliffs. Kale slept in a cradle carved from dark wood, blankets soft and warm. Alara knelt beside him, brushing a strand of wet hair from her face. "He's safe," she whispered, almost to herself, marveling that the baby was unharmed. Dorian stood by the window, looking out at the gray horizon. His back was rigid, his posture commanding, but his hands rested lightly on the sill, almost relaxed. Alara watched him, curious. "This place, it's enormous," she said quietly. "It has to be," he replied, not turning to face her. "A kingdom is not ruled by small things." She nodded slowly, feeling the weight of his words. There was a strange tension in the room, like the calm before another storm. Alara wanted to ask questions, to learn more about this man who had appeared in the middle of the tempest to save her and Kale, but the fortress felt alive with eyes. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of the room, and she felt the pull of old power in the walls. Dorian finally spoke, his voice low. "You should rest. You've been through much. Your body is as tired as your mind." Alara shook her head. "I can't sleep yet. Not while Kale, not while we," she stopped, realizing she couldn't explain the fear that still clung to her chest. Dorian's gaze shifted, his stormy eyes finally meeting hers. "I understand," he said. "Fear does not vanish simply because danger has passed, but you cannot protect him if you collapse. Even the strongest must rest." There was authority in his voice, but it was not harsh. It was firm, unyielding, yet patient. For the first time, Alara felt a flicker of trust, small but steady, like the first light of dawn after a long night. Later, as the day wore on, Dorian guided Alara through the fortress. Every hallway seemed alive with history. Statues of past kings and queens lined the corridors, and she noticed the intricate carvings on the stone walls, some depicting battles, others showing mystical symbols she could not understand. He led her to the library, a vast room filled with shelves reaching toward the ceiling. Books of all sizes were stacked on every surface, their spines worn and covered in dust. The smell of old parchment and ink filled the air. "This place holds the knowledge of centuries," Dorian said quietly, as if speaking to the room rather than to her. Some of it is dangerous, some of it is forgotten, but it is all powerful if you know how to read it. Alara ran her fingers along the spines, marveling at the sheer number of books. She felt small, almost insignificant, surrounded by centuries of wisdom. But there was comfort too. Knowledge meant understanding, and understanding meant safety. Perhaps here she could learn to survive, not just the storm but the world that had been cruel to her. Dorian watched her silently, his expression unreadable. Alara sensed that he was studying her, not in judgment but in curiosity. It made her uneasy but also aware. She did not know why, but there was something in his attention that made her heart beat faster. As evening fell, the fortress grew quieter. The torches cast long shadows across the stone floors, and the wind whispered through the high windows. Alara found herself sitting by Kale's cradle, watching him sleep. The soft rise and fall of his chest was calming, yet her mind could not rest. Dorian approached slowly, standing near the doorway. He said nothing at first, simply observing her, the soft flicker of torchlight catching the sharp angles of his face. "You carry a heavy burden," he said finally. "It is not just the storm or the night. It is the memory of all you have lost." Alara looked at him, startled by his words. How do you know?" she asked. "I see it in your eyes," he replied simply. "You try to be strong, to hold everything inside, but pain has a way of showing itself, even when we hide it." She felt a strange mixture of fear and relief. No one had ever looked at her like that, not truly. Not since before the village was burned. Her voice trembled. I don't know how to do this, how to survive, how to protect him. I feel powerless." Dorian stepped closer, and for a moment the air between them was thick with tension. "Power is not always strength," he said quietly. "Sometimes it is the courage to face the impossible. Sometimes it is knowing when to accept help." Alara swallowed hard, her throat tight. There was something in his voice that drew her, something that made her feel seen in a way she had never known. Yet fear lingered, fear of depending on someone so powerful, someone whose world she did not belong to. The night deepened, and the fortress became still. Dorian left her by Kale's side, but not before placing a small, protective hand near hers. She felt the warmth of it through her gloves, a silent reassurance that she was not alone. As she closed her eyes, exhaustion finally claimed her, and her head fell forward slightly, resting near Kale. Dreams came, fragmented and strange, filled with memories of fire, running, the roar of the storm, and a man's stormy eyes watching over her. The next morning, Alara awoke to the sound of the fortress stirring. Servants moved quietly along the halls, bringing food and water. Dorian appeared at the doorway, dressed in dark, flowing robes, his expression unreadable as always. "You must eat," he said. "Your strength will return only if you take care of yourself." She nodded, hesitant, and followed him to a small dining hall. The room was simple, yet elegant, with large windows overlooking the cliffs and the valley below. Kale slept in a cradle beside her chair, safe and warm. As they ate, Dorian spoke little, observing her quietly. But his presence was constant, a steady force that both unsettled and reassured her. Alara realized that he was watching her not with suspicion, but with careful consideration. It made her feel both vulnerable and strangely protected. After the meal, Dorian led her to a balcony overlooking the cliffs. The wind was strong but not harsh, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and the distant sea. The view was breathtaking, the valley stretching out beneath them like a living painting. "You survived a storm," he said quietly, "and you will face many more, but survival is not enough. You must learn to live, not just endure." Alara's gaze followed his, taking in the cliffs, the forest, the world that seemed so vast and dangerous. I don't know if I can," she admitted. "You can," he said firmly, "because you have no choice, and because you are stronger than you realize." A long silence followed. The wind whispered through the balcony, carrying a promise of change, of challenges yet to come. Alara felt a stir of something deep inside her, a mixture of fear, hope, and something else she could not name. Just as she was about to speak, a sudden sound caught her attention, a rustle in the forest below. She turned sharply, her heart racing. Dorian's eyes narrowed, his hand resting on the hilt of a hidden blade at his side. The moment was tense, heavy with uncertainty. The rustle stopped. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Dorian's gaze returned to Alara. "You see," he said quietly, "even in peace danger waits. That is the world we live in." Alara swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She realized that her journey was far from over. The storm outside the fortress had passed, but storms always returned, and the world beyond the walls was full of shadows waiting for the unwary. Yet, despite the fear, a spark of determination ignited within her. She would not be afraid. She would protect Kale, and somehow she would survive in this strange, powerful world that had taken her in. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting a golden glow over the cliffs, Alara felt a quiet sense of resolve. Dorian stood beside her, silent but present, his stormy eyes watching the distant forest as if he could see everything beyond the horizon. And for the first time, she wondered what it would mean to trust him, not just for survival, but for something more. Something dangerous, beautiful, and unknown. The shadows of the past lingered, but so did the promise of what lay ahead. And Alara knew, deep in her heart, that the storm had brought more than danger, it had brought her to him. The fortress was quieter than usual that evening. Torches flickered along the stone walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. Outside, the wind whispered through the high windows, carrying the scent of rain-soaked forests and distant mountains. Alara sat near Kale's cradle, brushing a lock of damp hair from his face, her mind restless despite the calm surroundings. Dorian stood at the window, his cloak drawn tight against the chill. His gaze was distant, lost in the gray horizon beyond the cliffs. He was always present, yet always distant, like a storm waiting to break. Alara watched him carefully, noticing the tight line of his jaw, the way his hands clenched and unclenched as he stared out at the world. Something lay hidden there, something he did not share. The air in the chamber was heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, unable to bear the silence, Alara spoke. "Dorian, you are not like anyone I have ever known. You carry so much." He did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I carry a burden older than you can imagine, one that has shaped this kingdom and shaped me. You see only what I allow, but there is more, much more." Alara felt a chill. "What kind of burden?" Dorian's eyes darkened. "A curse," he said simply. "A shadow that runs through my bloodline, tied to storms, to power, to loss. It cannot be broken by force or cunning alone. Only something unselfish, something pure can calm it." Alara's brow furrowed. She did not fully understand, but she felt the weight of his words settle over her like a stone. "A curse?" she asked. "Then is that why the storm came that night?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, storms follow me, even when I wish for calm. They are tied to my pain, my anger, my fear. When the world threatens me, when I lose control, they come. The storm that night was not just weather, it was a warning, a reflection of my own unrest. And yet it brought you to me." Alara swallowed hard. The storm had terrified her, almost drowned her hope, and yet it had also delivered her into his hands. There was an irony in that she could not ignore. "Then the storm saved us," she said softly, almost in disbelief. "Yes," Dorian replied, his gaze lingering on her. "But it did not end. Storms are only quieted by understanding, by sacrifice, by trust." Alara looked down at Kale, asleep in the cradle, the soft rise and fall of his chest grounding her in the moment. "Trust," she whispered. The word felt fragile, almost foreign. She had trusted before and lost everything. Could she trust this man, so powerful, so unknowable? The next day brought an uneasy peace. Alara explored the fortress under Dorian's watchful eye, learning the rhythms of this strange, powerful place. Guards moved silently, their eyes sharp, their movements precise. The servants were careful, polite, but distant, as if aware that she did not belong but had been chosen by fate to stay. Dorian did not hover over her constantly, yet his presence was always near. She could feel him observing her, analyzing her movements, her reactions, the way her eyes followed Kale, the way her hands trembled when she thought no one was watching. One afternoon, while exploring the library, Alara discovered a hidden section behind a tall bookshelf. Inside were books older than any she had seen before, their spines cracked and fragile. One book, bound in dark leather with a storm carved into its cover, drew her attention. She opened it carefully, feeling the weight of history in her hands. The pages were filled with symbols and stories she could not fully understand, but one section caught her eye, a prophecy, written in careful, looping letters. The blood of the storm carries both power and pain. Only by surrendering fear, by embracing courage, can the shadow be broken. Only the pure of heart can calm the tempest and release the burden of the cursed king. Her heart skipped. She remembered Dorian's words, the storm that night, the warning hidden within the wind and lightning. Could it be that the prophecy spoke of him? Of her? Of both? Footsteps approached, and she hastily closed the book. Dorian's voice, calm but steady, spoke from the doorway. "You found the prophecy." Alara turned to face him, her pulse quickening. I think I did. Does it speak of you?" He stepped inside, his eyes dark but soft. "Yes, it speaks of me, and it speaks of the one who can stand beside me. The one who dares to face the storm with courage, who will not be swayed by fear." Alara's hand shook slightly. "Then, what am I supposed to do?" "You do not know yet," he said. "The prophecy does not spell out the path. It only shows the possibility. The choice is yours as much as it is mine." The day faded into evening, and a sense of foreboding settled over the fortress. Dorian had left her to tend to Kale, but the air seemed charged with warning. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and shadows seemed to deepen in the corners of the halls. Suddenly, a distant horn echoed across the cliffs. Alara froze, her heart pounding. The sound was a signal of danger, one she had only heard of in stories of war and betrayal. She rushed to the window and looked out, seeing movement in the forest below, figures moving quickly, shadows among shadows. Dorian appeared silently at her side, his presence strong and commanding. "Enemies," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "They have found us sooner than I expected." Alara's pulse raced. "Enemies here?" "Yes," he said, his eyes narrowing. "They know weakness when they see it, and they believe protecting you makes me weak." She took a step back, fear gripping her. What do we do?" "We fight," he said simply. "And you stay close to Kale. Your courage will be tested tonight." The hours that followed were tense and chaotic. Dorian moved with the precision of a man who had faced countless battles. Guards positioned themselves at every entry point, weapons drawn. Alara clutched Kale tightly, heart pounding as the fortress shuddered under the threat of attack. Through the night, shadows moved along the outer walls, arrows flying, swords clashing, the sound of boots echoing through the stone corridors. Alara could barely breathe, gripping Kale so tightly her fingers ached. She watched Dorian fight, not recklessly but with calculated power, each movement precise, controlled, yet filled with force. She could see the toll it took on him. His face was pale, his jaw tight, his eyes sharp and unyielding, yet beneath the control, she sensed the weight of his curse pressing down on him. Every movement, every strike, seemed to carry the burden of storms, loss, and pain. Finally, after what felt like hours, the enemy retreated. The fortress gates were secured, guards exhausted but alive. Dorian returned to Alara's side, his hands resting briefly on her shoulders, grounding her in the aftermath. "You see," he said quietly, "the world will test us. It will try to break us, to show us weakness. But strength comes not from avoiding storms but from standing through them." Alara looked at him, awe and fear mingling in her heart. He was powerful, terrifying, yet deeply human, burdened, yet brave. She realized that her feelings were shifting, growing in ways she did not fully understand. Fear, respect, curiosity, and something more. Something dangerous and thrilling. Later, she sat with Kale, rocking him gently. Dorian stood nearby, silent, watching the boy sleep. There was a rare softness in his posture, a quiet moment that seemed almost impossible after the chaos. "Alara," he said finally, his voice almost gentle. "You faced fear tonight, you protected Kale, and yet you did not falter. That is courage, true courage." She looked at him, unsure of how to respond. I only did what I had to," she whispered. "No," he said firmly. "You did more than survive. You stood in the storm when others would have run, and in doing so you have begun to calm it." Alara's chest tightened. The words felt heavy with meaning, as if they carried not just praise but a responsibility she did not fully understand. She looked down at Kale, sleeping peacefully, and then back at Dorian. His stormy eyes met hers, holding something unspoken: respect, recognition, and a depth of feeling she could not yet name. As night deepened, the wind outside rose again, echoing the distant threat that still lingered in the forests beyond the fortress walls. The storm within the kingdom was not over. The prophecy was not yet fulfilled, and Alara knew that the path ahead would demand more than courage. It would demand trust, sacrifice, and a willingness to face not only the world's dangers, but the storm within the Alpha King himself. The fortress was quiet that morning, but the air carried a restless energy, like the calm before a storm that had not yet passed. Alara stood by the balcony, the wind tugging at her damp hair. Kale slept in a cradle nearby, soft and unaware of the tension that filled the fortress. The sun had not yet broken through the clouds, leaving the cliffs and valleys below shrouded in mist. Dorian appeared silently behind her, his cloak catching the wind, his eyes scanning the distant forest. "The enemy will not give up easily," he said, his voice low but steady. "They believe weakness is in our protection of you." Alara turned to face him, a mix of fear and determination in her expression. "Then we must show them that courage can match power," she said softly. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that the challenges ahead were not only for survival, but for something far greater, the calm of the storm that followed Dorian wherever he went. Dorian's eyes softened, just slightly. "You are stronger than you realize," he said. "But the storm within me is not only strength or power. It is tied to loss, anger, and the shadows of my ancestors. To face it, one must be willing to stand in the eye of the storm itself." Alara nodded, gripping Kale's blanket tightly. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she felt the weight of it in her chest. The storm that had first brought them together had not passed. It lived in Dorian and it lived in the world around them, and she had a role to play in it, whether she liked it or not. The morning passed in tense preparation. Dorian called the guards, giving orders with precision. Alara watched quietly, noting the respect and fear the men had for him. Even in moments of danger, he moved with calm, controlled power. Yet she also saw the toll it took on him: the tight line of his jaw, the restless movement of his hands, the shadows in his eyes. As the sun reached its peak, a messenger arrived from the forest below, breathless and muddy. "They are coming," he said, voice shaking. "The army approaches. They know your strength, but they underestimate your unity." Dorian nodded, his face unreadable. "Prepare the defenses. Every gate, every wall, every path must be ready, and keep her and Kale safe at all costs." Alara's heart tightened. "I am not afraid," she said, though her voice wavered. "I will do whatever I can." Dorian's eyes met hers, storm-gray and unreadable. "Courage alone will not be enough. You must face the storm within yourself as well as the storm outside." Hours passed and the tension mounted. The distant rumble of drums and the sound of marching filled the valley. Shadows moved among the trees, the enemy closing in. Alara felt her chest tighten with fear, yet also with determination. She would not allow Kale to see fear in her eyes. She would protect him. Finally, the first attack came. Arrows whistled through the air, striking the fortress walls with sharp thuds. Guards shouted, swords clashing, and the sound of battle filled the air. Dorian moved like a shadow, his presence commanding the battlefield, his movements precise and deadly. Every strike seemed to carry the weight of his curse, the storm within him flowing through each motion. Alara clutched Kale tightly, watching from the safety of the inner courtyard. Fear threatened to overwhelm her, but she took a deep breath, remembering Dorian's words. Courage was not the absence of fear, it was the strength to face it. She would face it. She had to. As the battle raged, she noticed a strange energy in the air, a pulse, almost like the heartbeat of the storm itself. Lightning arced across the sky, though the clouds above were distant, far beyond reach. She felt it in her bones, a connection between Dorian, the fortress, and the storm that followed him wherever he went. Then, amidst the chaos, a surge of realization struck her. The prophecy, the hidden words in the old book, the storm itself. This was not just about surviving the enemy. It was about standing beside Dorian, facing the tempest within him, and helping him release the curse that had haunted his bloodline for generations. She stepped forward, determination in her eyes. Guards glanced at her nervously. "What are you doing?" one asked. "I have to help him," she said firmly. "I can't just hide, I have to stand with him." Dorian fought in the outer courtyard, his strength unmatched, but the storm within him was rising, reflected in the growing thunder and flickering lightning above the cliffs. Alara ran to him, Kale safely in the arms of a loyal guard. She moved through the chaos, unafraid of arrows, unafraid of the shadows. Fear still lingered, but it no longer controlled her. She reached Dorian just as a bolt of lightning struck near the edge of the courtyard. He glanced at her, surprise flashing in his storm-gray eyes. "Alara, stay back," he shouted, his voice sharp with worry. "No," she cried. "I am not leaving, not now. I will face this with you." For a brief moment his face softened and she saw something almost human in him, not the ruler, not the Alpha King, but the man beneath the storm. And then the sky roared, and the lightning seemed to respond to the tension between them. Alara closed her eyes, summoning every ounce of courage. She remembered the words in the prophecy, the promise of purity and bravery. She opened her heart to Dorian, to the storm, to the power that threatened to consume him. She did not fight the storm, nor did she command it. She simply stood, unwavering, willing to face it fully. A powerful wind lifted around them, swirling in response. Lightning danced along the edges of the fortress, and the storm itself seemed to recognize her bravery. Dorian's sword struck with precision, yet his movements began to slow as the storm inside him shifted. Alara reached out, placing her hand on his arm, not to control but to connect, to share strength. The moment was electric. The storm roared, lightning splitting the sky, yet a strange calm began to settle over Dorian. His body stiffened, his eyes closing briefly, and then he exhaled, a long, trembling breath that seemed to release decades of pain. The enemy, sensing the shift, faltered. Confusion spread through their ranks, and the soldiers retreated, unable to withstand the combined force of Dorian's strength and the strange energy Alara had helped channel. Dorian opened his eyes and looked at her, storm-gray but now softened with relief and awe. You stood in the storm," he said quietly. "You faced what I could not face alone." Alara's heart raced. "We faced it together," she said. Her voice was steady, though her legs trembled from the effort and fear. The clouds above began to part, revealing a pale sun that touched the cliffs with gentle light. The storm was breaking. The fortress was safe. And something deeper, something invisible yet undeniable, had shifted between them. Dorian reached out, taking her hand in his. The touch was firm, grounding, yet tender. "Alara," he said softly, "you have changed everything, not just the storm, but me. I cannot explain it, but you have given me something I thought lost forever." Tears pricked her eyes, and she squeezed his hand. "I only did what I had to. We survived, and Kale is safe. That is enough." "No," Dorian said firmly, yet with warmth. "It is more than enough. It is everything." The fortress slowly settled into quiet again. The storm was gone, the enemy defeated, and the sun cast golden light across the cliffs and valleys. Kale cooed softly in his cradle, unaware of the danger they had faced and the courage his sister had shown. Ilara and Dorian stood together on the balcony, looking out at the valley below. The wind was gentle now, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and distant forests. She felt the calm in her heart, a peace that had been absent for so long. "You have faced fear," Dorian said quietly, "and you have faced me, the storm within me. That takes more courage than anyone I have known." Ilara smiled faintly. "And you have taught me that strength is not just power. It is standing even when you are afraid." A quiet understanding passed between them, unspoken yet profound. The storm had tested them, threatened them, but it had also brought them together, forged a bond that went beyond fear or duty. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky with gold and crimson, Dorian turned to her, eyes softening. "Ilara, will you stay? Not just to survive, but to stand beside me, to face whatever comes next together." Ilara looked down at Kale, then back at him. She could see the truth in his eyes, the vulnerability beneath the storm, the man beneath the king. She felt her heart swell with courage, with hope, with something she had never expected, love not yet spoken but deeply felt. "Yes," she said quietly yet firmly, "I will stay." The wind carried their words across the cliffs, gentle now, whispering promises of tomorrow, of a life forged in courage and trust. The storm was gone, and in its place was a new beginning, a redemption not just for Dorian, but for them both. The fortress, once shadowed by fear and darkness, now stood bathed in light. And for the first time, Ilara realized that the storm had not only tested them, it had guided them, shaped them, and united them. Together they watched the sun set, hearts steady, souls connected, ready to face whatever the world might bring.